Dear students, in the first two lectures we discussed what is sociology, what is sociological perspective, how to connect individual experiences with the broader social context, the intended, unintended consequences of social action. The idea was to give you a brief understanding of what is sociology. Now, I move on to the course which is Science, Technology and Society. Today, I shall discuss different historiographic traditions in history of science. History of science is a specialized branch, a sub-branch of science as well as sociology, where the scientists or the historians of science, they look at the development, evolution of scientific structure, scientific developments, scientific thought process in a historical context. This discussion is mainly drawn from Thomas Kuhn's contribution to Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, which came out in 1968, and there he wrote a piece called The History of Science. And in the article on history of science, Thomas Kuhn has essentially traced different origin of history of science, the factors of change of historiographic tradition within science, the internal history and the external history of science, the two important thought processes which have stimulated the interest of scientists themselves as well as historians of science, that is Morton's thesis, and within that how Morton has discussed the influence of Francis Bacon as well as the Puritanism as a major stimulant for scientific development. So, this is roughly the framework. We will just discuss the history of science, how important it is, the factors of change, three historiographic traditions, then internal history and the external history of science, then look at the Morton's thesis in support of it and a critique of it. Now, essentially the history of science as a special subject, as a sub-branch, is of recent origin. By recent origin we mean it is a product of 1950s, and mostly the historians of science were found in 1950s United States of America. So, it has a new origin, and most of the practitioners or the professionals who practiced history of science were from US. Now, Thomas Kuhn says that there are two historiographic traditions which is of note, which needs to be mentioned when we discuss the subject history of science. First is the early 19th century narratives which are written by practicing scientists on their specialities. The history of science initially started with the practicing scientists, the professionals, particularly the eminent ones, the eminent scientists. They wrote on their own subject matter, they wrote on the history of their subject. So, this practicing professionals, while writing about the history of their subject, history of the sciences that they were in, intended to elucidate the concepts of their specialty. They wanted to explain further the different concepts which are part of their subject matter. They also wanted to establish a scientific tradition of their subject, the subject of the field as a separate scientific tradition. That was also one of their aims. They also aimed by writing such books to attract the students into the gambit of that particular field of science. Now, if you look at the examples of such kind of scientific work done by professionals themselves or the practitioners themselves, there is Lagrange, who has written a book on mathematics, who has written where he has traced the historical development of historical evolution of mathematics. Montoya, who has written history of mathematics and physical sciences. Priestley has written a book on electricity and optics, where he has dealt with the evolutionary growth and development of electricity and optics. Then Delambre, who has worked on history of astronomy. So these are examples of scientists or practitioners of particular fields who have written books in their subject matter as historians of science themselves. As I told you, the idea was to elucidate, explain the concepts of their specialty or the branch of scientific knowledge that they are part of. Idea was to attract more students, researchers into that field, to get them interested in such field so that they can pursue further research in that field and take the scientific knowledge further, to advance scientific knowledge in those fields. And they were also, through the process, establishing a separate tradition of that scientific knowledge, of that scientific field. Now, the second historiographic tradition is philosophic in nature. It has philosophical objectives. So we can put it in the form of philosophical concerns of creative activity in the history of science. Francis Bacon was one of the first who emphasized upon the tracing of human reason, uses of human reason in scientific subjects, in the histories of learnings, in the history of scientific subjects or history of learnings. He wanted to look at how human reasoning has developed through such scientific works over a period of time, over generations, over centuries. Now, a prime example of such activity, such creative activity taken up is that by Condorcet and Auguste Comte. They were highly influenced by Francis Bacon in their historical surveys of Western scientific thought, because they based the normative guidelines of true rationality while doing historical surveys of Western scientific thought. So in their survey of Western scientific thought, in a historical context, they made use of the normative guidelines of rationality and human reasoning and logic, how it has found its place in a evolutionary manner in the Western scientific thought in a historical context. One of the major trends of history of science in the early periods is that they are essentially chronology of accumulating positive achievements in a technical specialty. How scientific knowledge has been incremental in every technical specialty, in every sub-branch of science. That has been the focus of historians of science, to look at such accumulating scientific developments in different subfields. A chronology of such accumulating scientific achievements has been the concern of historians of science. Idea? What is the idea? What is the objective? Is to further deepen and clarify the understanding of current contemporary science by displaying the evolution, by looking at the evolution of scientific knowledge in different specialty. They are trying to clarify and deepen further understanding of the current knowledge, current scientific knowledge, contemporary science. How the contemporary science or contemporary technical specialties have evolved over a period of time, and that is done through such understanding and discussion of, exploration of, chronology of accumulating scientific knowledge, positive scientific knowledge in different technical specialty. Now, there are certain factors of change which has led to such evolutionary approach in history of science. One of them is that shift in the philosophical approach, where there was an attempt or there has been efforts to distinguish positive knowledge from error and superstition. For instance, Bertrand Russell, he said, and this has been, the history of science here has been highly influenced by the philosophy of science, the philosophers. How philosophers looked at their own subject and the past philosophers. How did they evaluate the contribution of the past philosophers? Bertrand Russell said, a philosopher said, it is by empathizing with them. Don't look at the past philosophers with reverence, with respect. Don't look at them with contempt. Don't criticize them, but empathize with them. Be one of them to understand. Get into the mind of the philosopher who has made such a particular contribution. How and why the philosopher thought it wise to make such argument. You got to empathize with the philosophers, and that idea has been transferred to history of science, where the scientists, they look at the history of the science, the subject matter, how it has developed through the scientists themselves, how the scientists have looked at their own subject matter, what they were intending to invent. Many of the times, what scientists intended to invent is not what they came up with finally. What are the problems they worked at? What are the objectives they had? What are the intentions they had while they started their experiment, their research? One of the ways in which history of science was written was by looking at how the scientists themselves drew material from the past. For instance, there was an importance attached to past for tracing the evolution of scientific process. Like if you want to understand the 17th century science, if you want to make sense of the development and the significance of 17th century science, we must look at the medieval science. That is one of the ways to understand how 17th century science has developed. Go back in time, look at the origin, the base of 17th century science in the medieval science and the sciences that developed prior to that. So, due to discovery of medieval science and its Renaissance role, the general history and history of science can be integrated. Now, this is a third historiographic tradition looking at the positive achievements in science as a whole, where there is an argument that the general history of science can always replace the history of specialty sciences, because this general history of science will capture the development in scientific knowledge as a whole. So, you do not have to have a history of specialty sciences. You can have a general history of science where the scientist will look at the history of sciences of all the knowledge streams and look at the positive achievements as a whole. That is a third historiographic tradition. Now, this particular tradition of general history of science replacing the history of specialty sciences has not found favor of late, because even if you are a tremendous scholar, a great scholar of history of science, still your scholarship would not be able to find a coherent narrative in the different scientific tradition. They would not be the such scholarship would not help to locate a common evolutionary pattern of all these technical sciences, of all these specialty sciences. So, this idea of general history of science can replace the history of technical specialties is out of favor within history of science. Within the discipline of history of science, there are many historians of science, they say that this idea is untenable, that even if you are a great scholar of history of science, still you cannot find common evolutionary pattern, some common coherent narrative in all these technical specialties, all these specialties. This has also further led to the impossibility of looking at past when you are trying to understand the division of current scientific knowledge. When you are looking at the bifurcation of scientific knowledge into different fields and subfields, we tend to look at the past, to look at how it has developed in the past, how it has bifurcated. But that has also become a difficult task, near impossible task, according to Thomas Kuhn. Now, there have been some attempts at general histories of science, like for instance in the works of Paul Tannery and George Satin. They are the people who have attempted to write the general history of science, and for them it is an attempt to understand the current division of knowledge in science curricula. But of late, such effort, such argument has been negated, saying that if you are a great scholar, still it is difficult for you to find a common coherent narrative in the evolutionary pattern of all these technical specialties. It is difficult to trace the evolution of different branches of science in the current times. You cannot find the roots of such bifurcation in the past. Then there is another way in which history of science or the historians of science have been influenced, and that is by looking at the role of institutional and socio-economic factors in the development of science. Sciences have developed in response to specific social needs, economic incentives, or there are some institutional factors, there are some political support, or directly or indirectly certain religious doctrine has helped develop sciences at particular period of time. So that is also one of the concerns of historians of science, by looking at the role of institutional and socio-economic factors in development of sciences. Now we come to the internal history of science. The internal history of science is concerned with substance of science as knowledge, whereas the external history of science is concerned with the social activity of scientists in groups, in particular social or cultural context. One of the important ways in which internal history of science has developed is by looking at the science from its scratch, looking at the science from the scientist point of view. What the scientist look at, how the subject, here the subject refers to the scientist. When you are writing a history of science, you are looking at the contribution of different scientists, and for them, the historians, such scientists become the subjects. Hence, what problems his subject, that is what problem the scientists themselves worked at, which is being investigated by the historians of science. How this became problems for them, how these problems were identified by the scientists, how it became a problem for them, how they went about researching this problem, what is the solution, what are the factors that led to the invention or discovery in that field by that particular scientists. Now, there have been few professional historians also who have looked at the history of science. Now, these professional historians are from the field themselves. They are the practicing scientists who have written professional account of the history of their science. Now, in the history of science in particular, what has been found according to Thomas Kuhn is that physics, chemistry and astronomy has dominated the literature of history of science. When you look at the history of science, mostly the dominant literature is the history of science or history of physics, history of chemistry, history of astronomy. They have been the major contributors in terms of history of science, mainly because that these sciences have been well established long time back. Hence, there have been many investigations into the history of these sciences, history of astronomy, history of physics or history of chemistry. But there have been very few on biological and earth sciences, mainly because of his delayed professional status. Biology essentially was in the medieval period was associated with medicine and physiology. So it took time to establish itself as a separate field of inquiry, separate field of scientific inquiry. Hence, such a delayed professional status, delayed status as a scientific enterprise in itself probably led to lesser histories of biology in the last 100 years. That is how Thomas Kuhn argues. Or that is the same case with earth science also. The delayed professional status led to less historical work in those areas, in the areas of biology and earth sciences. Now, even if there are some histories written on biology, mostly it concerns itself with 19th century Darwinism or 17th century physiology. But this history of 19th century Darwinism, for instance, does not look at the history of other technical specialties of that time. Thomas Kuhn argues that the technical specialties which was in existence during Darwin's period, it provided a body of problems and data to Darwin to work upon them, and which led him to come up with his theory of evolution. So, in the absence of exploring of history of technical specialties which are contemporary to Darwin's evolutionary theory, it's very difficult to establish. When you read these histories of Darwinism, it's very difficult to establish how it can be an original contribution in itself. Forget about as original contribution in science itself. So, such efforts were at best piecemeal, patchy works. For instance, in biology, where there was no attempt to link Darwinism with the other technical specialties of that time. Hence, this exercise becomes futile according to Thomas Kuhn. There have been very few, almost negligible history of social sciences. One example of history of social science can be given is that of Boring's history of experimental psychology or history of American anthropology. These are two examples that has been cited by Thomas Kuhn as examples of history of social sciences. Now, if you look at the external history, there have been three types of external history of science. One is a study of scientific institutions, where the idea has been to set science in a cultural context, in a social context. And one first attempt of this kind is the study of scientific institutions. Bishop Spratt's study of Royal Society of London is an example, or Guerlac's professionalization of French chemistry is an example, or for that matter, Sophield's history of Lunar Society, or Caldwell's study of England, or Dupree's study of US. These are all examples of study of history of scientific institutions, which is mostly of use to historians in general and historians of science in particular. The second attempt within external history of science is looking at the impact of science on Western thought process. How scientific ideas have impacted upon, have an effect on extra scientific ideas, on philosophy, on religion, on literature, on politics. For example, Nicholson's study of science in 17th and 18th century literature, or Roger's work on role of life sciences in 18th century French thought can be cited an example within this attempt, where the historians of science have looked at the impact of science on Western thoughts. The third attempt of within external history is that of study of science in a geographical area. Essentially, though it may appear limited, that if you limit your study of how French science has developed, or how American science has developed, or how Indian science has developed, but still it gives you a picture of the social setting, the cultural context within which science has developed. Like for instance, you can talk about the impact of French Revolution on science, American science, and the most prominent one, the development of science in 17th century England, a original thesis by Robert Morton, which tells a lot about the origin of modern science as well as the nature of history of science. Now we come to the Morton thesis, because he is the one who established this field called sociology of science by looking at the different social needs affecting, determining, governing scientific research. And to do that, he took the example of 17th century England, which is at the height of industrial revolution, and he looked at how social needs of that time, under the impact of Baconian reasoning, inductive reasoning and scientific experiment, led to development of scientific research, led to technical innovations, how the social structure, social needs led to development of scientific and technological research in 17th century England. Now for that, Morton drew inspiration from two domains. One, the Baconian influence, or that is Francis Bacon's influence on the scientists of that era, and second, Puritanism, a religious doctrine, how it led to further exploration of nature, which ultimately resulted in scientific developments. But this principle, this idea that Francis Bacon had a lot of influence on scientists of 17th century England in terms of emphasis on experimentation, observation, instrumentation, has not found favor amongst the current historians of science. Thomas Kuhn says there has been lot of arguments which supports as well as criticizes the Morton thesis. For instance, one argument is that the Francis Bacon's ideology or his argument, his prescriptions about scientific method was not only confined to scientists. It was not uniformly accepted across the class. It was not uniformly accepted across culture. Many of the scientific inventions of 17th century is a result of internal evolution. For instance, Galileo's scientific contribution, many scholars argue, is a result of traditional thought experiments brought to new perfection. Many of the inventions and scientific contributions in the 17th, 18th centuries have been the result of flash of genius, result of brilliant minds of certain individuals. Nothing to do with Baconian principle. It had nothing to do with Puritanism. There was an emphasis on justification through works. There was an attempt to commune with God through nature. So those Puritan principles did not work with many of the scientific developments that came about in 17th and 18th century. Mostly it was a result of internal evolution or flash of genius. But still, all this criticism does not negate Robert Morton's original contribution to sociology of science, where he established a close relationship between society and science, social needs, religious doctrine, and scientific development. Finally, we come to the last part of the discussion of Thomas Kuhn's History of Science, where he says that nowadays better histories of science are being written. More practitioners are emerging who are writing histories of science, and it bodes well for further research in the history of science, because one of the ways in which history of science can be looked at is that it is rich depository of old ideas. Now such old ideas can also be drawn upon to solve and explain many of the current scientific problems. Two fields which it is connected to, that is history of science, is very much linked to philosophy of science as well as sociology of science. Many of the philosophers of science nowadays, as Kuhn puts, like Feyerabend, Lakatos, Popper, all these people have realized that the traditional philosophic view of or image of science is inadequate. So they are looking at alternatives, and for such alternatives, history of science provides the platform. Sociology of science can also take a lot of help from history of science, in the sense that history of science helps sociology of science to understand and explore the shape of the scientific enterprises, the structure of scientific enterprises, structure of scientific disciplines. And in return, sociology of science helps history of science in science administration and science policy making. And finally, he says, as Derek Price has coined this term, science of science. Science of science is also emerging within the history of science as a separate and interesting field of inquiry, where the idea is the theoretic analysis of structure and behavior of science itself, and mostly the technique used here is econometrics, history and sociology to understand the science of science. The history of science holds immense potential for policy making. It is a great stimulant for policy issues in science. And that is how Thomas Kuhn would explain or describe the importance of science, the history of science. So today we discussed the history of science. In the next lecture, we'll talk about positioning of social sciences and humanities within technology institutes, the philosophy and the current state of affairs in Indian context. Thank you.